Using artificial intelligence, Italian scientists are piecing together the text that was lost, and what they reveal through this advanced infrared imaging are previously unknown details.
2,000 years ago, when Vesuvius erupted and buried Herculaneum, it entombed an entire library, papyrus scrolls cooked into charcoal, unreadable.
Excavators found what could be the richest repository of ancient Western wisdom, a library filled with papyrus scrolls.
With AI, the unseen has finally been summoned from ash.
Ancient scrolls that were buried in volcanic ash during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius are now being deciphered 2,000 years later, thanks in part to artificial intelligence.
This is a quote from Democritus, who was an early Greek philosopher and is very well known for having postulated with others.
One scroll questions the very idea of an afterlife. Another exposes the raw edge of spiritual illness.
Such a discovery would represent the earliest Christian material that we have, almost dating back to the time of Christ and the disciples.
Researchers believe these words point to a warning that reshapes our understanding of the ancient world long lost to history. Brent Seals's mission. Vaults of knowledge containing decades of philosophy, history, and science were locked away in darkness for 2,000 years, till one man, Brent Seals, a computer scientist at the University of Kentucky, made it his life's mission to read what no human eye was ever meant to see again. When Seals first proposed a way to digitally unwrap the ancient scrolls through a non-invasive imaging process capable of revealing writing hidden within solid material, he turned to the Institut de France and the Bodleian Library at Oxford, custodians of the Herculaneum scrolls. But his request was denied. Their reasons were understandable and tragic. The scrolls, discovered in the 1970s inside a grand seaside villa at Herculaneum, were the only complete library to survive from the ancient world. It was believed to have belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, the father-in-law of Julius Caesar and a known patron of philosophers. When excavators unearthed his library, now known as the Villa of the Papyri, they uncovered over 1,800 papyrus scrolls.
Villa of the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. In it, they found a library with at least 1,800 ancient scrolls with texts in Greek and Latin.
However, the pyroclastic surge, a wave of toxic gas and molten ash that devoured Herculaneum, had carbonized the organic material in an instant.
The heat of this cloud was enough to carbonize and preserve, rather than destroy, all kinds of information,
transforming parchment and papyrus into fragile black cylinders, their shapes almost intact, yet their pages unreadable. They were too brittle to touch, too dark to see through, and every attempt to unroll them ended in destruction. In the 18th and 19th centuries, mechanical attempts to unroll the papyri using dampening agents, blades, and intricate machines only turned the priceless artifacts to dust. Even chemical and radiographic approaches failed. Traditional imaging could not distinguish the carbon-based ink from the carbonized papyrus itself. By the early 20th century, optimism had turned to despair. The scrolls lay preserved yet voiceless, museum curiosities that dared not be handled. But where archaeologists saw fragility, Seals saw data. He believed buried within the dense layers of those papyrus rolls was a 3D code that could be mapped, interpreted, and virtually opened. His method, later known as virtual unwrapping, relied on a combination of high-resolution scanning and machine learning to reconstruct the internal geometry of the scrolls. Seals' approach was deemed controversial and too experimental, with archaeologists questioning whether computational methods could ever succeed where centuries of careful preservation had failed. Yet Seals remained confident, convinced the scrolls could be read without physical contact, and further risks to their survival. He advocated for a method that fused high-resolution imaging with machine learning. Each papyrus, he argued, was a three-dimensional puzzle, layers of carbonized material containing traces of ink, invisible to the naked eye. By training algorithms to detect the subtle variations within the carbon, he theorized the writing could be reconstructed virtually, revealing the words exactly as they had been inscribed. This vision inspired SEALs to create the Vesuvius Challenge in 2023, alongside Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross. This initiative offered a $1.5 million prize pool to anyone who could decode one of the most promising and fragile scrolls in the Herculaneum collection. The goal was precise: unlock the ancient text without touching a single papyrus physically. The technical process was meticulous. Computed tomography scans were used to capture the scroll in astonishing detail, layer by layer. Each image was segmented to isolate the delicate contours of the papyrus, mapping the invisible folds and wrinkles that had trapped ink for centuries. Once segmented, machine learning models were trained to distinguish ink from carbonized papyrus. These algorithms learned to detect patterns invisible to conventional scanning methods, reconstructing text where it had seemed entirely lost. After months of refinement, the team successfully decoded 15 columns of Greek text from the scroll, the first legible words to emerge in more than 2,000 years. But the content of the scroll is where the real mystery begins. The lost words. The first clear signal to rise from 2,000 years of silence was porphyra, which means purple. On the surface, it seemed too trivial, but in the ancient world, purple was never just a color. It was power made visible, the hue of emperors and gods. A dye so rare it was said to cost its weight in silver, drawn painstakingly from sea snails along the Mediterranean coast, each drop a symbol of dominance and desire. That one word was enough to electrify researchers. It suggested the voice behind the scroll might indeed belong to Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher who wrote with fearless insight about pleasure, virtue, and the illusions that enslave the human spirit. In his ethical writings, Philodemus often used vivid material imagery to illustrate his ideas, not to glorify luxury, but to reveal its trap. Researchers believe purple may describe the shimmer of temptation itself, the human craving for status, admiration, and permanence in a fleeting world. In Roman society, purple robes wrapped senators and emperors alike, a fabric of authority, yet also of vanity. However, Epicureans, who valued simplicity and inner peace, saw such indulgence as an obstacle to true happiness. But the word's resonance doesn't stop there. Porphyra appears throughout Greek and Roman literature. In Homer's Iliad, to describe the surging purple sea, and in the plays of Aeschylus and Euripides to evoke blood, grandeur, and fate. In these texts, purple was a liminal color, caught between splendor and destruction. So when the scanners first revealed porphyra, it seemed like a warning against the human need to possess what can never truly be held. Perhaps the most haunting discovery within the Herculaneum scrolls is a fragmentary word, phobos, meaning fear. Only part of the word appears in the AI reconstructions, yet its presence is impossible to ignore. In Epicurean philosophy, fear was not treated as a passing emotion or weakness, but as the single greatest barrier to human freedom. It was the root from which all anxiety grew, the fear of death, of divine punishment, and of judgment by others. But there's something about this word that researchers warn against overlooking. Epicurus and his followers argued that most fear comes from misunderstanding the natural world by believing that the gods interfere in human life, or that death is something more than the quiet end of sensation. And so this single word may hold crucial clues to how ancient philosophers understood and challenged the idea of an afterlife. The Epicureans believed that fear of what comes after death was a cultural failing, the result of myths and rituals that convinced people that punishment or judgment awaited them beyond the grave. In his other writings, Philodemus examined how fear distorts judgment and how philosophy could train the mind to resist it. This word supports the controversial theory that links the scroll to the ethical writings of Philodemus, proving that the Herculaneum scrolls were not just random or decorative objects. They carry deep meanings and are links to direct conversations from the 1st century about what keeps people afraid and what it might take to stop being so. Another word that has caused researchers to raise their eyebrows is diatrope, a Greek term meaning disgust or moral revulsion. Unlike earlier fragments that surfaced as faint traces, this word appeared several times across the text, clear, deliberate, and impossible to mistake, its repetition carrying an eerie urgency, as if the writer were desperate to be heard. In Epicurean philosophy, diatrope refers to more than mere distaste. It describes a moral or psychological recoil, a reaction against behaviors or emotions that disrupt the mind's balance. Philodemus explored these internal responses in humans, showing how people are drawn toward pleasure and repelled by what they believe to be shameful or corrupting. This word has significantly helped researchers narrow the possibilities of what the remaining scrolls may contain. Philodemus is known to have written a series of treatises on the passions, anger, arrogance, flattery, vices, and the opposite virtues. Diatrope likely belongs to this intellectual framework that deals with the ways emotions shape moral life. But this word isn't limited to Epicurean writings. Similar discussions appear in other ancient works. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus wrote of moral disgust as a natural signal for the rational soul to distance itself from vice. The great Aristotle, centuries earlier, described a comparable emotion in the Rhetoric and Nicomachean Ethics, calling it a reaction that guards moral boundaries, an instinct that warns us when something offends our sense of virtue. Philodemus, though an Epicurean, would have known these ideas well, and perhaps taken inspiration from them. This places him within that same intellectual dialogue of philosophers across rival schools, trying to define why humans recoil from certain acts, and whether that feeling comes from nature, habit, or reason itself. Another striking word hidden in the carbonized layers of the Herculaneum scroll is adioleptos, a term that carries both intellectual and moral weight. It translates roughly as foolish, or more literally, not to be grasped. In ancient Greek thought, words were rarely accidental, and this one stings with precision. To be called adioleptos was not merely to be unwise. It meant possessing a mind that cannot hold truth, that lets understanding slip through its grasp like smoke through fingers. In the moral universe of Epicurean philosophy, this was no small accusation. Its appearance among the first deciphered words fuels the theory that the scroll may belong to Philodemus's lost work, On Vices, a series that dissected the moral failings of human character with surgical clarity. In that context, adioleptos would not serve as an insult, but a diagnosis of spiritual illness. The Epicureans believed that ignorance and fear were the twin roots of suffering. To live foolishly was to live chained to illusion, fearing the gods, worshipping wealth, and mistaking noise for wisdom. This word is meant to awaken readers to their own blindness, a philosopher's way of holding up a mirror and forcing his audience to look. The foolish man, in Philodemus's view, wasn't wicked by nature but was misled by false beliefs, clinging to shadows instead of truth. But the most disturbing part is knowing the Romans once read these texts at the height of their reason, Yet their world crumbled under the same blindness their philosophers warned against. This reminds us that there is an enduring struggle between illusion and understanding, one that humanity still struggles to grasp. The word biou, the genitive form of bios, meaning of life, also made a remarkable appearance in the scrolls. On its own, it might seem ordinary, a word so common across Greek texts that it often goes unnoticed. Yet in this context, researchers say its presence carries a haunting significance. Found among the short readings from the Bodleian scans, biou confirms what many scholars suspected from the start, that the scroll was never about technical subjects or records, but about questions of human conduct and ethics. In philosophical writing, biou was never just about biological existence. It was the measure of how one lives, the pursuit of balance between pleasure and reason, and the principles that define a life well lived. When Epicurus and his followers spoke of the good life, they meant one free from unnecessary pain and fear, guided by reason and simple pleasure. Biou belongs to this same tradition and reflection on what constitutes a meaningful or tranquil life. This word hints that the scroll may be a meditation on the art of living. It feels less like a fragment of distant philosophy and more like an ancient reminder, whispered through ash and time, of how humans can shape their lives with intention, clarity, and calm. But these lost words aren't the only revelations drawn from the Herculaneum scrolls. Recently, researchers uncovered a burial site whose details could rewrite classical history. The discovery of Plato's grave. In 2023, Graziano Ranocchia, a researcher at the University of Pisa, led a team that uncovered what may be the first written clue to Plato's lost grave through another carbonized scroll from the Herculaneum collection preserved in the National Library of Naples. Using AI-assisted imaging and machine learning models, Ranocchia's team virtually unwrapped the scroll, and inside they found a philosophical text, likely Epicurean, describing in striking detail Plato's death and burial. The decoded passage placed his grave in a private garden within the Academy of Athens, near a shrine to the Muses, rather than a public tomb or ceremonial ground. For centuries, scholars had imagined Plato's burial as either a civic honor or a philosophical symbol. But this text suggested something more intimate, proving that Plato's followers did not merely honor him as a teacher, but revered him as a man touched by divine insight. And for researchers, the implications are mind-blowing. If a single scroll could resurrect the burial of one of history's greatest minds, then countless other secrets, like lost graves, vanished temples, and forgotten rites, might wait within the yet unread fragments still sealed in the Naples scroll collection. Yet, as more discoveries are made, the boundary between recovery and reinterpretation grows dangerously thin. Questions have begun to surface about the possibility of political manipulation and institutional bias, claims that could alter the credibility of the scrolls. What if the words decoded are not the ones the ancients wrote, but the ones modern hands wanted to find? The implications of the discovery. Some scholars warn that AI's power to reveal may also corrupt. Ancient texts, they argue, weren't meant to be interpreted by code, but by context. Algorithms could misread, misclassify, or even fabricate connections that no human ever wrote. And behind every dataset is the quiet hand of those who chose what to show and what to hide. Among the loudest skeptics was Italian physicist Vito Mocella, whose own work had once been hailed as a breakthrough. Years before Seals's Vesuvius challenge, Mocella had used X-ray phase contrast tomography, a method that detects minute variations in ink density, to peer inside the same Herculaneum scrolls. In 2025, he published results claiming to have identified the faint outlines of Greek letters, the first tangible proof that words could be recovered without opening the papyri. But Seals was cautious. The letters, he argued, lacked clarity and reproducibility. What Makela saw as ink, Seals saw as noise. The two camps began to drift apart, with each side defending its philosophy of truth. On the European front, Emmanuel Renoir and his team pushed the limits of imaging even further. Working with high-energy synchrotron radiation, the same technology used to probe molecular structures, Renoir's group captured three-dimensional scans of the scrolls in microscopic detail. Their results were breathtaking. Crisp internal maps of layers, folds, and textures finer than a human hair. But access was limited, and so was collaboration. Competing labs held proprietary data, institutions guarded their scans, and interpretations began to diverge. But the most dangerous implication of this discovery borders on who controls the narratives. With AI-driven reconstruction like the Herculaneum scrolls, the line between discovery and interpretation has been blurred. If an algorithm inferred a missing letter, who decided whether it was genuine, the code, or the scholar behind it? This debate has grown into a question of ethics. Who owns the knowledge extracted from an artifact? The team that scans it, the institution that stores it, or the civilization it once belonged to? Should the decoded texts be made public or kept in academic custody to avoid misinterpretation? The same algorithms that could revive lost voices could also amplify bias, turning archaeology into a mirror of political and institutional agendas. And yet, even amid controversy, progress didn't stop. The technology that read the Herculaneum scrolls is now being turned toward other relics, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, Egyptian papyri sealed in resin, and medieval manuscripts too fragile to touch. Each project pushes the limits of what can be known, extending the reach of light into history's darkest corners. Researchers are beginning to imagine something even more ambitious, using AI to reconstruct lost languages, to map trade networks from fragmentary records, and even to simulate the sound and cadence of extinct tongues. For all the tension and rivalry, the promise of AI remains extraordinary, confirming that the past isn't lost. It's waiting for someone brave enough to read it again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen.